Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to part 28 and final part of my Joseph Losey season. Thanks very much if you've endured the whole season. We're going to finish with his final film, Steaming, from 1985. It's not a film about Glasgow alcoholics. This is based on a play by Nell Dunn. The script is by Patricia Losey, Joseph Losey's wife, who did co-wrote 4 of his films, including Don Giovanni. It stars Vanessa Redgrave, Sarah Miles, Diana Dors, Brenda Bruce, who was the prostitute in Peeping Tom, That'll Be £2, and Patty Love. This is quite a sad film. Both Diana Dors and Joseph Losey died in 1984 before the film was actually released. This was Christopher Chalice, the famous DP. This was his final film. It was edited by Losey's regular editor Reginald Beck, but not production designed by Richard MacDonald, who did a whole bunch of Losey films. This is about a group of women. It's pretty much shot in one location, in one set, 'cause it's from a play after all, in a local council run Turkish baths for women only, where kind of 3 regulars, if you will, which conveniently are kind of from the upper class, middle class and working class, sit about, shoot the breeze, fall out with each other, reconcile with each other, and then they get a bombshell halfway through the film that the council decide to sell off the Turkish baths to make a sports leisure centre. And the women decide to do something about it and launch a campaign to have a speech at the local council to try and halt the demolition of their beloved Turkish baths, which is kind of a safe haven for them, a place they can talk about men and sex and fantasies and money and work and all that kind of thing. But as I said, it is quite a sad film. I mean, the set itself is it's a rundown place, and obviously the story itself is about change and trying to stave off change. But it is interesting because it's not young women, it's older women. Julie Christie, who worked with Joseph Losey in The Go-Between, turned it down because there is lots of female nudity, obviously not sexualised nudity, it's literally taking clothes off and on because it's a sauna and a Turkish bath. And Jacqueline Bisset turned it down for the same reason. Vanessa Redgrave didn't really want to do it because of the nudity, but apparently, in quotes, she was so desperate for money that she did it. She was paid £100,000. So again, it's a fairly sad story all the way around. And obviously Losey and Diana Dors had died by the time the film came out. The script, I have to be honest, isn't really that good. It's fairly simplistic, as I said. There's Vanessa Redgrave plays the upper class woman whose husband has left her. Sarah Miles is kind of the the middle class, if you will, the businesswoman with no kids, and Patty Love is the working class woman who comes in to the story with a bruise on her jaw. She gets a black eye later in the film, from a man, not from one of the women. And she is the kind of stereotypical, likes lots of sex, and a few of her men have been criminals, and she gets beaten up, and she works in a topless bar, and at one point there's the typical outrage by her character at Sarah Miles and Vanessa Redgrave. It's a fairly predictable script. Brenda Bruce, she plays, again, an older woman. After all, Peeping Tom was 1960 and this is 1985. And she has a daughter that is perhaps a little slow. So she's kind of looking after her, and again, this is a place they kind of go to relax, a kind of safe haven, if you like, from the dastardly men in their lives. Because it's 1985, it does also suffer from a fairly terrible score, which has a couple of fairly dreadful songs that open and close the film, again with that horrible 80s drum sound. I would quite like to know who was the first person or producer to decide, yes, let's have that horrible drum sound that it seemed everybody was using in the 80s. And it is a very synth heavy score, which doesn't really suit the film. Again, for Losey, who you could make the argument his films are fairly male-centric, it is an interesting project for him to do with an all-female cast. Again, because I have packed my Joseph Losey book, I didn't really find out whether this was a job for Losey or whether it was one of his passion projects, because generally there's a difference between the quality of a Losey film depending on whether he's fully engaged with it or it is literally just to pay the rent, essentially. So unfortunately for me, this isn't a great film for a director to end his career on. Apparently was pretty much riddled with cancer when he was making it. But there's still some Joseph Losey wonderful mise-en-scène. There's some nice shots and composed shots. But overall, this feels very stage-bound as it is, based on a play. And the performances are okay. There's a couple of moments that perhaps goes a little bit over the top. But on the whole, not a great film to end on. But interesting nonetheless, just for the whole melancholy and bleakness of it. I mean, it's fascinating for me as an outsider of human behaviour. You know, the women spend a lot of time in this film slagging off men. You know, if you work with men or hang about men enough, they will slag off their partners, their wives and girlfriends. And I've never really understood that. You know, if you dislike the person that you have decided to spend time with, then you maybe need to question your own decision making. You know, if men and women are so terrible, then just stay away from them. You'll probably be happier. And again, because some of the women have children, and of course the working class character Josie, her children are been in Borstal and are heading for jail because she's working class, obviously. And Vanessa Redgrave's children are going to university and boarding school. Sarah Miles doesn't have children, and no matter how kind of strong and independent she feels, deep down she still wants to have children. So it's a fairly typical kind of broad look at women as far as what they want and what they need. But again, if men are that terrible, or if women are that terrible, if you're attracted to women, then just don't bother. You'll probably have a happier life. So that's steaming. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it and say, oh, this is a Joseph Losey film that you really need to watch. I'm not going to do that. For me, I would probably stop at Galileo, even though Don Giovanni is very nice to look at and the music's nice, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a film. So now that I have finally reached the end of my Joseph Losey series, what are my conclusions? That's a very good question. Where does Joseph Losey stand? Is he actually a great director? Or is he a director that kind of did a lot of jobs to pay the bills, kind of got lucky with his relationship with Harold Pinter, was always trying to be an art house director, but was he actually an art house director? Always pushing the envelope of doing an opera, doing a film about Galileo, trying to push art, but always fighting against, the commerce of the film industry. Well, I think when Joseph Losey is engaged in a project, because obviously we've talked about films that he was literally hired after a director got fired, or he literally did just to pay the rent and support his family. But when there's projects that he is engaged with, that's when he does his best work, strangely enough. When he has a good script, as with the Pinter films, that's when he does his best work, strangely enough. Obviously the House of Un-American activities, investigations hurt him when he had to go on the run. And you could understand why he did have the reputation of being a little bit irascible. As I've discussed these films, I've told stories of him falling out with producers, falling out with production companies, falling out with actors, falling out with cinematographers, falling out with people who do the music. You could argue there's a lot of times where he seems to be blaming everybody else for his film's failures at times. Has he made some great films? I believe yes. I think Mr. Klein's a masterpiece. I think The Go-Between is a masterpiece. I'm perhaps not as high on The Servant as the kind of consensus is, but it's still damn near a masterpiece. Things like Boom and Galileo were really amazing surprises. Lots of his earlier films are really nice, efficient little potboilers. Personally, I feel when he overextends himself, when he tries the hardest to be art house, if you like, I don't think he's fully successful at that. I think he's a fascinating director. That's why I did this series. Does he have films that are duds? Certainly. Most filmmakers do. Does he have little gems? Absolutely, like King and Country with Dirk Bogarde. Even though it's a minor film, The Sleeping Tiger with Dirk Bogarde is fantastic. So I think it's interesting that the last 5 years he has kind of been reassessed. Obviously Indicator and Studio Canal, Criterion have recently released The Servant. So his kind of stock has risen over the last 5 years, and hopefully that continues. But where does he rank all time? I'm not even sure. I think when I did my last director rankings, he was in the top 40. Did I do 40? I might have done 40. He was in the top 40, but he wasn't that high. Because again, a lot of the times the films he did were kind of dependent on who he had in the crew, and lots of films he did were actually just to pay the bills, and that's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I know in the kind of film watching community we all think and have this vision of directors and actors, only choosing certain projects, and they're all works of passion and they put every ounce of their soul into these pieces of work. But the reality is lots of the time you are trying to pay the bills. But for some reason with art we try to think above that, and our directors are above paying their bills. I mean, I think Losey has his flaws just like most directors, but obviously his experiences in the 50s in America probably didn't help, but he's certainly a director that I'm glad I've looked into, because again, there's so many films that I would have never seen, never searched out if I wasn't doing a series. And really I will be keeping the majority of these films in the collection. I'll be honest, I might not be keeping Steaming in the collection, but the majority of them I certainly will be keeping. And again, if it wasn't for this series, I might not have watched Mr. Klein. I mean, I might have got to it eventually, because it does have Alain Delon. But I'm so glad, as I say, I've watched films like Boom, which some people say it's one of the worst films of all time. I consider it almost a masterpiece. I agree with John Waters about Boom, ! So I hope you think this has been a worthy series. I know the viewing figures haven't been that high for it, but hopefully over time Losey will get a bit more kind of a reassessing of his work, considering a lot of his films did actually play at Cannes, and I think one or two actually won at Cannes. So thanks very much for watching this series. I'm not going to promise any more series until I move, because I'm well aware there is a series I talked about a year ago and I still haven't done. So I'll probably just appear with a series, but I will be going dark in a few weeks, probably for maybe a month or something like that, while I move location, fingers crossed. But there will be more director series coming. I think I have about 6 directors off the top of my head. But again, I'm not going to make promises I obviously can't keep. I'm not going to write checks my body can't cash. So thanks very much for watching this journey through Joseph Losey. Not all of his films, because obviously a lot of them are hard to find, and a lot of them, as you've noticed, are on DVD only and not very good copies in DVD. But as I said, over the last maybe 2-3 years, a lot of his films have went to Blu-ray, which is always a good thing. So thanks very much for watching, and I hope you join me for more director series. Please let me know in the comments what your views of Losey are, as his overall career. You can let me know what you think about Steaming if you've seen it, and hopefully you'll join me again, as I say, for more director series in the future. This is Solitude Ronan from Solitude Ronan Films, saying farewell